So one of the most common questions I get asked on streams is which factions are the best? My answer always being it depends on what you're measuring. And today I will be looking at the first pickability of each faction in a pick one ban two situation. Starting off with the Bretonnians, they have a bad matchup versus the Dwarves and Lizardmen, with Vampire Coast giving them a run for their money too. But since that's a matchup you can definitely train for, they're overall a pretty good faction. Of course, there's also the bottom tier factions where mains basically never touch them. The likes of Dark Elves because of Greenskins, Bretonia, and Wood Elves, Dwarves because of the High Elves, Beastmen, and Skaven, and Norska because basically every matchup is looking rough for them nowadays. For a faction that doesn't really have any terrible matchups but has a ton to learn, that's going to be more the place of Empire. And the reason I have one bad matchup above many unfavored ones is because many people who main a faction will tend to master that single bad matchup to do well in tournaments. Meanwhile, if you have many unfavored matchups, it can take a lot more time to feel comfortable bringing the faction as a first pick. But what are some of the best factions? One with no bad matchups at all? Well, that's going to be the likes of the Beastmen, of course, who are pretty happy after they've banned Coast and the Vampire accounts. Chaos, who could ban Coast, Dwarves, but honestly just banning based on your preference will generally give you an even fight. And the Lizardmen, who can more or less do well after banning Coast and Skaven. Now before you go and tell me that the Dwarves are going to be wrecking the Lizardmen, generally in my experience, at the higher levels of play, Lizardmen players usually don't fear Dwarves that much. Back to factions where you usually see specialists come in, Vampire Coast does well if you can figure out how to beat Empire and High Elves. You'll be banning the Vampire Counts and Wood Elves most often. Vampire Counts also has many specialist players that only need to figure out how to beat one of the elf factions. The unholy trinity of Dark Elves, Wood Elves, and High Elves giving the Counts the most trouble, and the Greenskins who can ban Vampire Coast, Lizardmen, or the Counts based on preference. From there, the rest of the matchups can be pretty even. But for the last four factions, we'll start with the High Elves. They, much like the Empire, have many bad matchups after their first two bans of Bretonia and Greenskins, but each matchup is only slightly unfavored, so a lot of High Elf mains still manage to get by. For a faction that doesn't get by though, definitely the Skaven rarely see play as a first pick, and the Tomb Kings haven't really seen much play recently either. They're a faction that suffers a lot more to the dwarf counter picks, and even if they ban some of the worst matchups like Chaos and the Vampire Counts, they'll still have quite a few more coming at them. And lastly, for the Wood Elves, they are going to be in the unfavored matchup section. The reason being is because they'll be banning Bretonia and Greenskins, and they have a lot of uphill battles ahead of them. And that's gonna be it. If you disagree with the analysis at all, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to learn more about the Warhammer competitive scene, please check out the other videos on my channel.